How's it going? And welcome to episode 50 of On the Wire, proud member of the Pitcher List Podcast Network. Follow the pod on the Twitter at On the Wire Pod. Of course, if you're listening on a platform that allows ratings and reviews, please take a second to let us know what you think. I am Adam Howe. You can follow me on the Twitter at 80grade. That's all spelled out. And I'm once again joined by Kevin Hasting, who should be followed on the Twitter at HastingKevin. And Kevin, we made it to the big 5-0, episode 50. I know that's probably not a big deal to a lot of people listening, but it's a big deal to me. It seems like a little bit of a milestone, especially since we did it within one calendar year. We were pretty consistent every week. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think it's a pretty big deal. I thought about it earlier in the week, and I'm really happy about the guest we have this evening being here for our 50th. I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, our guest definitely passed the 50 mark a long time ago, I would suspect. But we'll jump right into it. We're very fortunate to be joined by one of the titans of the industry, who probably has been, like I said, has been doing this a lot longer than probably everybody listening right now. Jeff Erickson of Rotowire. He joins us to make sense of the game that we all love to talk about. And hopefully very soon we'll be able to talk about it a little bit more actively as we were recording this on Tuesday during the week, and we're keeping an eye on the news, on the Twitterverse, to see if anything legitimate comes through. But of course, Jeff can be followed on the Twitterverse at Jeff_Erickson, and can be heard just about everywhere. Rotowire can be found from podcast feeds to Sirius XM radio, and of course, lending his voice to other podcasts like this one. Jeff also puts together the player projections over at Rotowire, so we'll be taking some time to pick his brain about that and how he does it, focusing on how he determines and adjusts his playing time for each player. And we'll talk about a few players he may be thinking have a different role than maybe other sources out there are thinking. So before we get into that, though, Jeff, thanks so much for joining us for our 50th episode. How you doing?
Doing great. I just passed 50 in years last year, so it resonates there with me there. So all good. But yeah, I got the world beat. I get to write and talk about fantasy sports for a living, so life is pretty good. But I'm thrilled to be on here, guys. I really appreciate it. The whole Pitcher List Network has cranked out all sorts of great work, and congrats on your 50th episode.
Thanks. I think we were also pumped. It's a very small little thing, of course, but we have the at Baseball Pods doing their bracketology right now. I think it's the third year that they've done it. Jeff, you did something awesome. I think the first year is that you had guests on your show that you were actually going up against in the first round, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, you down with OBP. That was our matchup there, and we had a little podcast together. That was fun. I didn't get a chance to do it last year. I think we just couldn't. I forget why, but I did talk to the guys, listen to them. And the whole point of that podcast, and Chris does a great job, Baseball Pods does awesome work doing that, is just you get to learn about some great podcasts. My big problem is I just don't have enough bandwidth in life. I try to listen to as many podcasts as I can. I'm taking my dog for more walks than ever, but I'll tell you, especially now that we're getting closer and closer to the start of the season, knock on wood, it's impossible to keep up, but it is really cool. And it's fun to meet new people. And plus every Thursday I have a different guest on our show. So now I know more people to have guests, more guests to have on. I'm on Tout Wars. It means I get to get exposed to some people. Through that, I got to know Toby from Bat Flip Crazy, Bubba. They're now in Tout, and it's an ever-expanding universe, and hope to have more and more people doing it. And we're trying to add more leagues to accommodate that, too.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I love the fact that you have the different voices coming on your Thursday show as well. Something we've strived to do since day one, and I think we've only doubled up our guests. I think only 2 or 3 people, Kevin, have been on the show more than once, and so we'll continue to do that throughout the course of the season. And yeah, we got to play in the tournament last year. We were in the play-in seed, and we won our play-in bracket. We're pretty proud. We had 3 episodes under our belt at that time. So now we haven't gone up yet. But by the time you're listening to this, we may have already lost or won our bracket. Who knows? But if we're still in it, please make sure to go in, vote for us. But more importantly, like Jeff just said, listen. Even if you're not listening to us, listen to somebody else. Put a review out there. That makes all the difference to pretty much everybody in the entire bracket. All right, let's get right into it, guys. We're going to start off like we normally typically do in our moving target section. As we get closer and closer to heavy drafting season, as we say, March is that time of year, we get into much more of our opportunities for people to be drafting in their fab leagues. So these are the players that we may be considering drafting at the last couple rounds of a fab league, whether it be a 12-teamer or 15-teamer. You can go in either direction. We usually say try to keep it to post 350 ADP, and you can use whatever kind of time frame you want to like make sure you get to talk about the player you wanted to talk about. But Jeff, as the guest, I'm going to let you start off. You got a couple names on here, and they're all very different names. So I'm going to let you go in whatever direction you want to go with here.
Sure. And I cheated. I had 3. I couldn't narrow it down to 2, but Roansy Contreras is a guy that I'm interested in. The team aspect of it isn't great. The fact is he's on the Pirates, and we know they're not going to get a whole lot of run support. However, I look at the roster. I look at the people that are purportedly in front of him on the depth chart. I'm not really worried about him getting the time. I think the question is, does he get into the rotation on day one? I love what he did, not just at the September call-up, but more importantly, when he did at AA. He was the big prospect that came over in the Jamison Taillon trade. 76 strikeouts and 12 walks and 54 innings at AA Altoona. Had one good start at AAA, and then got the call in through 3 innings in his last outing of the season. You're looking for late strikeouts at this point. And we're talking about someone that's getting drafted in the 400s. You're really not looking at someone that you're going to have to invest any sort of real draft capital on. Pick 421 from February 1st on in the NFBC. And I'm just trying to find guys that can miss bats at this point in time, looking for over 20% K percentage. And I think he's got that upside sort of potential there. And that's all I'm looking for. I realize that you might be running the risk of not getting a whole lot of wins. And unfortunately, that is a category we are chasing. But I think he's a strong contributor in 3 categories. So at that price, I like him quite a bit.
Yeah, I think I mentioned on last week's episode, I've been wanting to put him on this list, my list in this section for weeks.
Oh, I saw your thunder. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's funny is that on the show notes, I had him and pretty much anybody in the Pittsburgh rotation on this list, because you can pretty much get anybody from the Pittsburgh rotation post 350 in any draft. I was looking at Zach Thompson. I was, looking at Contreras as options. And the one thing I like about picking one of these Pittsburgh guys is that early in the season, you run into a lot of teams that they don't go with a 5-man rotation because they have a couple of off days. They can get away with it. Contreras may not even be in the rotation to start the season, but Pittsburgh, with the first 2 series being swept away or swept under the rug for now, as if we're recording this, the Pittsburgh only has 1 off day in the first series, but they don't have another off day for the next week and a half. So they don't have a lot of flexibility for going with a 4-man rotation and skipping guys. So he might force his way into that rotation just out of necessity of having to have that arm. And then maybe they send them back down to manipulate some more service time if they need to. But I do like the situation that Pittsburgh is in. You want to rack up those strikeouts early in the season, not just in the middle at the end. You need everything you can get.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Kevin, let's go with one of your guys, and then we'll do a little round table.
I took one of your Red Sox tonight, Adam. Jarren Duran. It's all about the strikeout rate, it appears, that he had when he came up and got his start with the Red Sox last season. Just 112 plate appearances, but a 35.7% strikeout rate. That's got to come down. The projections have it coming down into the mid-20s. And we're looking for some speed here at this point in the draft, some late speed, not empty power. I don't know if we see 16 home runs and 283 plate appearances ever again from him, but most of the projections, including Jeff, having for double digits in between 400 and 500 plate appearances, depending on what you're looking at. And as long as that strikeout rate comes down to the mid-20s, then we're looking at 250-ish to 260 projected batting averages. So a nice spot for some late speed that doesn't come with empty power.
Yeah, I do wonder if Duran's going to be on the opening day roster in Boston as well, just especially with the trade for bringing back Jackie Bradley Jr. in center field. So I wonder how that playing time is going to work out for him, but I do think throughout the course of the year, you're pretty happy with any adjustments that you make. And I think you're going to know pretty early on whether or not you're going to want to hold on to him or stash him if you have the ability to do, especially in the NFBC, like we talk about. Obviously, no NA spots, no IL spots. You have only those limited bench spots to hold.
And the thing about Duran, too, is that 35.7% K percentage is super scary. But you look at throughout his minor league career, it peaked in the 20s, low 20s, 23% or so. Now, there is a qualitative difference between AAA and the majors, obviously. And last year, James Anderson was talking about this with Phil Dussault. I don't know if you caught that podcast, but there was a bigger gap in the quality of AAA pitching than there usually is too. So a lot of hitters, if you look at their AAA numbers, they might have been inflated a little bit. Nonetheless, he didn't have the time to adjust at the big league level last year. It usually takes a certain number of reps. He only had 112 plate appearances at the big league level. It's going to take some time. It will come back down. And I think when it does, the average will come back into the line a little bit. Obviously, Boston's a contending team. That's the difficult part of that there. And they're in a division where there's 4 teams contending. And you sometimes don't get the luxury of time with prospects on the Red Sox or on any other competing team, like in a tight race like that. Expanded playoffs might ease that concern a little bit. We'll see what happens. I like the pick, though. I think it's especially commensurate with the cost. Low 400s. You're not someone especially in a draft and hold format there where you have big rosters, you can wait your time. If you're playing the 12-team Rotowire Online Championship in the NFBC, it's hard to stash someone like Jarren Duran. You're playing a 50-round draft, especially the draft champions when you're going 15 teams. Yeah, a guy like that, a huge boom guy that can be like that you can stash on your bench. I like it.
I wonder what kind of narrative was really around to the fact that he played with Team USA and playing in the minor leagues and then being pulled off of Team USA in order to get the call up to Boston as well, and how much that actually impacted him as far as just the mental aspects of the game as well. So he's going to have a clean slate going into 2022.
That was a lot of COVID travel as well.
Sure.
Yep.
All right. I'm going to jump into I'm going to get both my guys because they fit in the same kind of a strategic category. And guys I'm looking at are Collin, McHugh, and Daniel Hudson. Now, it's not specifically these two guys, but it's the idea of loading up the back end of, especially it's probably more so in a 12-teamer than a 15-teamer, but in TGFBI, I drafted both of these guys recently. My draft's still not over, but so I've gotten them toward the end of but what I'm looking at are high-end relievers that don't even necessarily have to find their way into a closer role. Daniel Hudson has been rumored the possibility he could end up getting some kind of save situations in LA if they end up using Trinan as more of a fireman or kind of mixing and matching based on matchups and all that. But besides the fact that I don't know where Collin McHugh is going to be, I do know that wherever he goes, he's going to be what he was in Tampa for the most part. And I'm just looking to rack up a few extra strikeouts, maybe get a vulture win in week 1 or week 2 and be able to churn these guys out at the end, especially with the week 1 is typically going to be that 4 or 3 game set in a weekly lineup switch, like in the NFBC, being able to just chalk up 2 or 3 strikeouts from these relievers I know are going to pitch, not so much having to worry about the fact that I have 9 pitchers and maybe have 7 starters and 2 relievers, but not all 7 of those starters are guaranteed to actually pitch in that first week. And so this is just a play to the extra strikeouts, just chip away, especially if I didn't necessarily hit strikeouts in my draft as much and I need anything I can get. Daniel Hudson, of course, even though he had his struggles last year playing in Washington and San Diego, still racked up one of his best strikeout rates of his career, closer to 32% in 37% in Washington, 32% in San Diego. And Collin McHugh has been Mr. Consistent over the last 2-3 years in that range, hit 30% last year in Tampa Bay, sometime in Houston as well, 25 and 26%, 33% the year before that. So again, this is not a long play. This is not a shot in the dark. Hopefully these guys get a certain role. This is more of I'm gonna treat the first week or 2 of April the same way that I would treat the last week of September and chip away at whatever I possibly can.
Yeah, you're getting Chad Green, but for 125 picks later.
There you go.
That's basically what you're doing. And the tricky part, obviously, is having him active to get all the goods that he brings. Chad Green had 10 wins and 7 saves and 100 strikeouts. You're probably not going to get that. But Collin McHugh, he can flat out pitch. He's just a good pitcher. And wherever he lands, whatever role he has, he's that guy that you can use when you don't have 6 good starters in a given week or 7 good starters in a given week. He's a guy that can fill in there. The tricky part is just trying to time the market with them. But I still think they're good pitchers, and they might back into the closer role, like you mentioned with Hudson. That's the added bonus. Again, the deeper the league you play in, the better off you can get. That happens, and especially in draft and hold leagues.
Yeah, I usually side door him in here anyway, so I would just throw Rich Rodriguez also fits into this mold for me, especially with Collin McHugh. We don't know where they're going to be if they find their way into a situation. Now, McHugh hasn't really been a closer, but there's not to say that he can't sign somewhere like Miami and then find his way into that role and then end up getting traded at the deadline because their value has been pushed up based on the role that the team forced him into. But like you said, it doesn't really matter what role they find their way into. He can still provide the value, whether it's the vulture wins or the strikeouts or what have you, as a glue piece. All right, Kevin, I'm going to jump back up to you. Got one more name on your list. I want you to hit him up, and then Jeff will let you close out with your last two.
Yeah, I have Tylor Megill here of the New York Mets. This is interesting. I've drafted him in a couple of spots already at this point in the draft. He's only been drafted in one of the 15 online championships that have taken place over the past month. So he's widely available in 12-team, 30-round drafts. Right towards the end, it's about the strikeouts. If he gets a starting role, and it's an if, most people have him projected somewhere between 20 and 25 starts throughout the season. The earlier, the better. And hopefully we know pretty early in the season at this point, low 4s ERA most spots, and the strikeouts at this point in the draft over a K per 9 up and down the board on the projection systems. It's worth a shot at this point in a draft.
Yeah. The only thing I caution is the price of doing business with Tylor Megill is going up. He just went in the 20th round of my TGFBI, got sniped on him, although he went after me in the 20th round. So it's my fault. I took Andrew Heaney instead, but I wanted Megill. He was in my queue. And I just thought, I have a better chance of sneaking him in later. Not so much. Brad Coleman from Baseball HQ snagged him, like the fourth in a row of picks that he was devilishly taking away from my loving arms. But you're moving markets, Kevin. Yeah, clearly the news is out. Tylor Megill is a great late round strikeout play, pitching in a good ballpark with an improved defense behind him. Yeah, I'm on board with this one big time.
Yeah, and to your point, Kevin, we talked about this, I think, last week or the week before. If there was a time to take a risk on somebody who doesn't necessarily have a rotation spot or a closer role or whatever, it's now. Because you find out by the end of March that they either do have the role and then you can't draft them because, as Jeff said, the market goes up, or you find out that they don't have the role and they're undraftable and you draft them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
All right, Jeff, you got two more guys, two very different guys. So why don't you pick and choose which one you want to start with? But
sure, let's go. Both. I'll do them a little quicker on this one here, but Carlos Hernandez on the Royals, love him. 5 different pitches. If you watched PitchCon, you saw Rob Silver extol his virtues. He's a good pitcher. He doesn't throw as hard as some of the other pitchers on that staff. You have to worry about the depth of that staff, that whether he has their role or they give him some sort of weird hybrid. He's just a good pitcher. I think I want to get more shares of him. I've had him a few places. I think he's going to end up being one of the main 5 guys on the Royals on a team that's sneakily going to be pretty decent this year, too. I think a lot of people are talking about the ascendancy of the Tigers for good reason, but the Royals are also going to be good. And the other guy I'll give you is an outfielder with the Houston Astros, Chas McCormick. Now, if the Astros don't bring in another center fielder, this is the lead guy, I think, in terms of getting the starting job. I like him better than Jose Siri. I like him better than some of the other options there. Power and speed possibilities, guys. Plus, he looks like Paul Sporer, his headshot does. So we got that going for us. But last year with the Astros, 14 homers and only 320 plate appearances. He's got a sneaky like 2010 possible upside, and you're getting him in the high 400s, mid to high 400s. You get him as one of your reserve outfielders, and he could be playing you could have an everyday job for the Astros in a good lineup, which means you're going to get some counting stats to go along with that. Even if he's batting towards the bottom, you're still going to get some runs and RBI out of it.
Yeah, Jeff, he's another guy with the strikeout rates were so much better in the minors. He did what he did last year in spite of a 32% strikeout rate.
Yep.
And in the minors, he was in the teens, so he could explode.
Yeah, when you can get a piece of the Houston lineup, regardless of where they are in the lineup, that's usually going to be a good thing. And I know that there's a lot of talk about Jake Myers at the end of last year making a run there, but obviously Chas McCormick seems to be the guy in center field, like you said, Jeff, over Jose Myers obviously being injured at the end of last year. So we will see how that kind of works out, whether or not they fill that hole, or if they see it as a hole in the first place, maybe they're perfectly happy with McCormick there and they can continue to develop him. All right, now it's time that we talk about how we adjust projections that we use for players based on our thoughts on playing time. But before we do that, we're going to take this quick break.
Hey, Alex Fast here, and thanks for listening to this podcast on the Pitcher List Podcast Network. If you're a fan, consider supporting all of us by getting a PL Plus subscription, where you're going to get an ad-free website and get access to our Discord, where you can talk to all of our podcast hosts and staff. Plus, you can hang out with our incredible Pitcher List community. It's basically a baseball sanctuary year-round for as low as $8 a month. You can sign up at pitcherlist.com/plus, and you're going to get your first month free with promo code podcast. Also, don't forget to check out everything else we do as well, from YouTube videos, live streams, newsletters, off-season articles, TikToks, breakdowns, over 15 baseball podcasts on our network. We can't stop talking about baseball even during the off-season. So sign up for PL Plus today at pitcherlist.com/plus and use promo code podcast to get your first month free. All right. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the show.
All right, so we're back, and we are talking with Jeff Erickson with Rotowire about the projections that he puts together over at Rotowire, along with how he determines how to put playing time associated with each player, whether it's their spot in the lineup or the depth charts or just skills and roles that they might have. But Jeff, talk to me a little bit about how you put together your projections in the first place. How much of your projections are straight, like algorithmic Excel documents, and how much of it is, all right, I see what the computers are spitting out, but I just have a feeling I'm going to tweak this manually?
So I wish I were better at manipulating Excel. I wish I had more of a programming sort of mind. I don't. I use 3-year weighted averages on Marcel the Monkey as a kind of a starting point. But think about the last 3 years and using 3-year weighted averages. It's a disaster. You got Happy Fun Ball in 2019. You got 60 games in 2020. Let me tell you, that wreaks all sorts of havoc in terms of getting the right amount of sample and just whether it's even telling enough of a sample. And then last year you had 2 different balls. You had the crackdown on the sticky stuff. There's a lot of things. And then the reaction to a 60-game season in terms of injuries and usage and all that goes with that. So I do a ton of manual adjustments, and then that's before even looking at like player by player. Okay, age, what sort of injury history, the organization, ballpark, all that sort of stuff. There's a lot of throwing stuff at a wall. I'm not going to lie. I wish I had the brain of Derek Carty just to program it all in, but I'm trying to estimate it in my best I can. And that's just to do the baseline projection. And then to try to turn that into a ranking, into a value is another different thing. How much do you factor in like the declining stolen bases in the game? How much more are you going to value those stolen base guys? Same thing with saves. There's the same amount of saves are in baseball, but they're dispersed among a lot more different pitchers. Our ability to roster those saves has diminished over time because of the Rays and the Reds and the Mariners and other teams like that. We need a lower target number now to hit our category targets. But so long story I'm trying a lot of different things to try to adjust that player's projection, whether it's playing time as well as his output.
Well, this isn't even considering the rumors that we're hearing right now with the CBA rule changes that could go into effect in 2023 with the larger bases and the banning the shift and the pitch clock and all that. Doing projections going into 2023 does not sound like a lot of fun based on the variables that we might. It's
difficult. You got to remember what we're still doing is trying to do projections for fantasy baseball, though. If it's not fun, then you probably need to find a different business. I complain about it sometimes, just as I complain about the value meter during football season, but it's still a fun act. It's a fun job. I don't have a real job, so I want to maintain that. But it's a layer of complication to say.
And then how much personally are you weighting like news articles that come out or interviews that you're seeing with managers or even GMs about how players might be used differently, whether it's in the rotation or their role as a closer or how they might be platooned, especially in the off season, especially this kind of an off season where any piece of news that we get in the last 3 months has been completely exploded into various ways. How much weight are you putting into that based on what you're actually seeing, on the field?
I try to use it as best as possible. The thing is, it's so disproportionate. We're so thirsty for information right now. It is ludicrous. We see the Anthony Rendon update was a source close to knowing his rehab says he probably should be okay for opening day. Oh, let's get him 150 games. No, that means nothing. You got to learn how to block that out to a certain extent. Similarly, the Max Muncy news, we've had 2 different updates in the last couple of weeks. In both cases, should be okay. And again, read the actual quote. It's different than saying the summarization of the quote. Wait till you actually get actual news. When we have this lockout ends everybody reports to spring training and teams can look at the players, it's going to be turning on a fire hose. And you're going to need a squad of like 100 Jeff Zimmermans to filter through all the news to try to get it to find out the good stuff versus what the noise is. It used to be ignore the noise, but so many times now, the spring training news, working on another pitch, best shape of our life, added 3 miles of velocity to the fastball. These things matter. Like Vlad Guerrero losing 40 pounds or whatever he lost, that was important. That mattered. And you got to be on top of that sort of stuff. And it's going to be from 0 to 100 just like that. That's the thing that's really scary.
Yeah, going into this episode, I would have died for a best shape of their life news tidbit, tweet or whatever picture.
He's walking across the parking lot with the laser teeth. It's come on, let's give me something here.
Yeah, Max Scherzer broke his phone, and that was the biggest news of that cycle. Kevin, when do you worry about hitters getting placed into platoons that weren't in platoons prior, or like what situations do you see out there now that could force a platoon player into full-time role? Like, so we're talking about playing time and how we're adjusting and how we're looking for different playing time situations. What situations out there right now are you looking at that you have a strong inclination could end up changing the amount of playing time that a player might see?
It's something we don't know till we start seeing lineups out there and how the lineups change during the games. We absolutely loved what Mike Curlin was doing all of spring training the last couple of years, updating the lineups and how the guys were being used for us. And I can't wait for that to start happening again. A couple of specifics that come to mind: fairly early in the season last year, we noticed Hunter Renfroe wasn't being platooned, and he was performing well. And that was really important. He ended up being a really good add in shallower leagues and somebody to keep in your lineup on a regular basis and not on your bench in deeper leagues. He switched teams. Is he still going to play every day? We have no idea. And we got to start seeing some spring training games. We got to start seeing them when we're seeing the presumed starters in there for at least a couple of at-bats every game. And then it's really important the first 2 to 3 weeks of the season. This isn't a wait till Memorial Day to start dropping players like people used to say. You got to start jumping on things that you see in the first couple of weeks.
And that also means especially jumping on picking guys up. Yes, every pickup comes with a cut, but in some cases, at least we have an IL spot in many of our home leagues, if not the NFBC. Yeah, making that we're going to have more of a churn, and we're going to make mistakes. And I think it's important to realize that, yeah, you're going to have to cut some guys early. You're going to get some things wrong, but this is all about getting the difference makers, and don't be afraid of making a mistake or two. If you hold by sitting out, you're going to miss out on so many good things that do come by. I remember when Jose Bautista broke out, I got him in 0 of my leagues. So I need to see him another week. Ben Zobrist, same year, same thing. When you see something emerge, you got to jump on it.
So that leads me to another question along the same lines, Jeff. It's like, when do you think role is more important than skill? And we had the added draft skill, not role, and vice versa. So you're talking about jumping on a guy because you start seeing the skills pop up and they might not necessarily have the role.
Saves for sure. It's possessions 9/10 of the law when it comes to that. Brandon Kinsler says hello with the Marlins in 2020, and there's countless examples. Mark Melanson last year led baseball in saves, for crying out loud, and he certainly wasn't the best skilled reliever in the Padres bullpen, but he's the guy that closed that first game. And next thing, he's a veteran closer. He's got the job. You have to pay attention to situations like that. It used to drive me crazy when Todd Jones would get saves every single year for the Tigers, and there was better arms in that bullpen. Joel Zumaya is just, hey guys, I promise not to hurt myself playing video games this year if you let me close. But nope, it was Todd Jones. I might be conflating eras there, but work with my example. But the thing is, that's super important. I think stolen bases are another one there, where where you are in the batting order is going to matter sometimes. Guy batting 8th or 9th isn't going to run as much as a guy at the top of the order. If a guy's in front of a hitter that doesn't want someone running in front of him, okay, he may not run as much. So sometimes that matters as much as the skills.
And Kevin, do you feel the same way? Like, we're talking about like rotation. I talk about it ad nauseum, but like Aaron Ashby's skills are obviously there, but that role may not be there to actually start the season. Is there a certain, situation in a rotation where you're more likely to hold on to a guy because they don't have a role, but their skills are so good, or vice versa?
It depends on the situation. That's a cop-out answer, but it really does. I try to, that's a situation where I hopefully have seen them play, that I've watched a couple of games, saw them get into the game and saw how they pitch, how they were used. I'd like to add something to what Jeff was saying about stolen bases. I haven't heard this talked about a lot. With a universal DH, guys at the bottom of the lineup on National League teams will attempt to steal bases more often.
That's true. Absolutely.
And so I don't know if projections are accounting for that.
No, I think you have to go person by person basis. Can they run to begin with it? The thing is, though, teams are you have to be able to be pretty successful at stealing bases to be allowed to run in the first place. So we'll see if they let that continue happen there. But yeah, that probably means we'll get a little slight bump in stolen bases, which may mean that devalues our top stolen base guys just a smidge, because we can find some other guys later.
And then we don't know what's going to happen. We're literally sitting here on Tuesday waiting for any kind of news that might pop up. But I think for a long time, most people listening and maybe even most people recording on this podcast right now, we're going into this season thinking, all right, we're going to see a shortened season, whether it's a shortened strike season because of something else happens, or the owners just keep everybody locked out for a long time. They've already canceled the first two series of the season. Jeff, did we learn anything from the extremely shortened season in 2020 that we should be focused on going into what could still end up being a somewhat shortened regular season in 2022, especially when it comes to predicting?
Things were so different then. If we get really if we go into June, then I think we might learn a little bit more. But as much as I'm pessimistic about the immediate status of negotiations, I'm trying to take a more positive long-term view that we're not going to have a 60-game season, because every month, Matt, add one more month, all of a sudden it's 50% more games than we had before. So hard to tell. I think and are we going to have a geographical schedule like we did in 2020? Everything was so weird. That's another thing we don't realize, is we don't mention that often. Shane Bieber was awesome in 2020, and he only faced AL Central and NL Central lineups. Oh, he didn't have to face the East. He didn't have to face the Yankees, Red Sox, Blue Jays. He didn't have to go out and face anybody out West. It's a little bit different. You didn't have to deal with as much travel that year. So all these things just make this almost a garbage in, garbage out sort of season.
Kevin, you won TGFBI on the shortened season, on the 2020 season.
That wasn't garbage, by the way.
No, but are you has this crossed your mind at all as you're drafting for this season in the many drafts you're doing, not just TGFBI, when it comes to drafting prospects maybe coming up earlier, as we did see in 2020, because they didn't have as much time to manipulate their service time, whether it be injury prone guys that have less time to be injured in a shortened season, rotations being used differently. The list goes on and on.
I don't think it's about the less time for injured guys. It's some of the guys that are recovering from injury having a little more time to recover right now. I'm taking that into consideration. Early in draft season, I wasn't touching Ronald Acuna. Then a couple of months ago, I had him in a couple of spots, and I took him 5th in a draft not too long. If he's going to be completely healthy for the start of the season, he's a top 5 player in my mind. So that's just one example. But more than the players themselves, as a fantasy player, 2020 was really easy for me to cut people. Jeff brought that up earlier. It was really easy for me to make my cuts. You didn't have to be a super major injury. And I told myself going into last season that even over a full season, that's what I needed to do. And I couldn't make myself do it. It's still so hard to let people go. And I'm going to continue to try to improve on that in 2022, even if we're at 162 games, if we're at 140 games, most definitely as the number of games may drop.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. That being the focus of your in-season management. In a shortened season, you have way less time to make those mistakes, if you will, of holding on to dead weight on your roster.
Last year, that was Carlos Carrasco for me.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And the thing is, we all have our bias. One of the most common biases is, and there's an actual phrase for it, but to summarize, it's you've drafted the player, you want to hold on to him a little more because he's yours. And so you have that as a bias in favor of keeping, as opposed to evaluating him fairly versus those remaining in the pool.
Yeah, I find my bias is when I draft players in my redraft leagues that I've had on my dynasty separately, which is my home league. I've had it for 20 plus years. When I end up drafting them, I feel way more attached to them on my redraft leagues, and I have a harder time because I'm like, all right, if he's not doing well here, he's not doing well in my dynasty, but I believed in him there. I have to believe in him here. Obviously, that's something you got to work on. All right, well, let's talk about a couple of different situations across the league as it currently stands, as we're looking at different, as I'm looking through the internet and finding different sources for depth charts, whether it be team depth charts or roster resources always quoted. Obviously, Rotowire has is a pretty deep depth chart as well for all the teams. Some of the names and situations on teams that kind of stood out to me when I compare three different resources. And we're going to get into a couple of those names and I want to get your guys' take on the situations at hand as they currently unfold before the fireworks start happening. Kevin, I'm going to start with you in Atlanta with Guillermo Heredia. So my question really is, with no real news about what's going to happen with Marcell Ozuna's situation with the Braves, whether he is on the roster, not on the roster, has any suspension attached to him or anything like that going into next year. If he's not on the team or he doesn't play, is Heredia someone that we should be watching to get 500 plate appearances?
I really don't think so. Maybe early in the season, he gets some playing time. The Braves are one of the teams that I expect to see some moves out of once we get a deal done here between the owners and players. And it's not somebody I'd be interested in anyway. Over the past month in 15 team draft and holds, he hasn't been drafted. Or actually, he'd been drafted one time. I looked it up. 0 times. I'm sorry. 1,012 players have been drafted in the last month, and he's not one of them. So if you want him, he will be available is what I'm getting at. I just don't see a lot there. I know projections that have him for a handful of home runs in just a couple of hundred plate appearances. So if he would get to 550, to answer your question, we might be looking at double digits, but I don't think he's going to get that playing time. I think if Ozuna is not part of the Braves lineup, Duvall moves to designated hitter and another outfielder or two are brought in. I don't see him. He's a nice guy to have off the bench. He can play just about everywhere, but I'm not interested in him in a fantasy league.
I suspect that the Ozuna will play. I think that they've talked about this is under the concept of basically time served. It's a retroactive suspension, not a going forward suspension. The Braves liked Heredia so much they went out and acquired Jock Peterson, Eddie Rosario, and Jorge Soler last year. So I think that's pretty much your answer. We know that and by the way, all those players are available on the free agent market right now. So at least one of them will be back in Atlanta is my bet. And depending on what happens with Freddie Freeman, maybe 2 of them. Heredia is a fine defensive player and he was okay in a pinch for a little bit, but yeah, he's not someone that's going to be a full-time guy.
That's fair. Jeff, in Baltimore, there are 4 middle infielders for 2 middle infield spots. And according to the Rotowire depth charts currently, it looks like you guys think that Jamai Jones and Odor will win out the shortstop and second base job, or at least as the main guys there. But you also have Jorge Mateo and Ramon Urias in the mix as well. Do you think that holds up? And if so, do you think that they hold on to those jobs?
No, I think it's a plurality, not a majority of playing time. And in fact, Mateo is someone who I like sneaking in as a late stolen base guy later on too, especially if you get the multi-position eligibility. You have to put someone first. It's not always an endorsement. And I think that's probably the indication here. I will say this about the Orioles though. If Mateo does get the job, they're exactly the organization that would let him run and let him run a ton because they're a bad baseball team, frankly. We saw it happen with Jonathan VR earlier a couple of years ago. But Mateo also, he isn't that old, but he's been around forever and teams haven't been willing to give him that much of a chance. Oakland took forever to dispense with him. San Diego found him wanting. Now you look at him now, it's just doesn't look like this might be the one chance he gets. So we'll see. Urias also, he was hurt at the end of the season last year. So that might be why he's a little lower on the depth chart too. I think that the degree of certainty here on their respective positions between the 4 of them is like 25% at best.
All right. And Kevin, let's stay on the East Coast and let's go down to Miami. We got Joey Wendle was just traded over there from Tampa Bay. The Rotowire depth chart has him listed as the top third baseman. Obviously, you have Brian Anderson over there as well. But I'm curious to know, what are you assuming Joey Wendle's role is going to be in Miami? And with at least an NFBC having dual eligibility at, a shortstop and third base, I believe, so giving you the corner and middle infield option, is this somebody worth targeting, thinking that he's going to get more playing time in Miami than he did in Tampa?
Yeah, a little bit, but I see like a San Francisco Giants thing going on here. If Garrett Cooper's healthy, he's playing. That moves Brian Anderson either to third base, or we got other things going on. Garrett Cooper could play first base instead of DH. They have more than they need, is what I'm getting at. If everybody is healthy, then we're looking at a San Francisco Giants situation, which is smart baseball. It's just not good for our fantasy baseball teams, but yeah, he'll get 450 to 500 at bats and be productive for it. Is what's really interesting about Joey Wendle. When you look at his page on NFBC, where it gives you the curve of where they've been drafted throughout the entire draft season, it's a straight line. He hasn't moved.
Yeah.
He's been in the same spot since October.
He pretty much is who he is. He's a platoon player. He's on the good side of a platoon. He can give you some speed. 1 year he had 16 stolen bases. That was nice. But counting on him to get a full-time gig is probably asking a little too much. In fact, as I'm looking at his page and I'm looking at my projection for him, and I need to give him a little less playing time. So there you go. Live update on projections coming up here, because I
breaking news.
few too many plate appearances. But you're right, Garrett Cooper could be back. Brian Anderson's coming off of shoulder surgery, so he probably won't be at full capacity to start the season. Regardless, he'll be in that mix at some point in time. Wendell's kind of a glue guy for a team. He's a better real-life player than a fantasy player because of the multi-positions. He's a good defender, very good defensive third baseman. So you might see him in late games as a result of that a little bit more often. If you guys remember the playoff run in 2020, how many great defensive plays he was making over at third base. That's something that speaks in his favor. He's going to be a guy that you're hoping to get 10 homers and 10 stolen bases from.
All right, and Jeff, up in Philadelphia, they have a need for an outfielder. I think everybody's very well aware of that, as they let Andrew McCutchen go and other members of that outfield from 2021, leaving some holes. But as it currently stands, Matt Vierling, who made his debut last year, is predicted by almost everybody to be somewhere in that lineup and at least compete for an everyday role in that outfield. And according to Roster Resource, I think they've got him in at DH. Our depth charts over at Pitcher List has him at DH as well, and second in line for first base, center field, and right field over at Rotowire. So my question is, should Vierling have 550 plate appearances penciled in for 2022, despite none of the projections over at Fangraphs having him over 504 and ATC in the bat, capping him out at 384 based on what they think his playing time is going to be?
The leading outfielder for one of those spots is not currently on the roster. This is a team that has a lot of work to do after the lockout ends. It's not going to be Vierling, I don't think. I know he had a nice little, it was a half a cup of coffee with the Phillies in the last 34 games. Did all right then, but if you look at his AAA numbers, they weren't special at all. He's fine, but he's not someone that should be a starter at this level, especially if you think of the Philly as a team that wants to contend. I do think they have to have some aspirations when you've got a core of Harper, Real Muto, Wheeler. You've got some pretty good parts on this team, but they need to fill in around it, and I think they will fill in.
Yes,
I think it's telling that he's got 77 plate appearances, so he's still prospect eligible, and he's not on top 400 or 500 lists anywhere.
No.
All right, so let's fly through this next one. Kevin, I'm going to jump over to Detroit for you. Spencer Torkelson versus Jonathan Schoop at first base, maybe mix in a little bit of Harold Castro in there as well. Of course, we've got Megill over there as well. But my question is, when Torkelson comes up, and I think it is a when, not an if, it may not be the start of the season, but it's probably going to be early on. Is there any reason to believe that he would share first base with either Schoop, Castro, or even Megill once he's actually up?
Absolutely not. He won't be up. He's playing every day, whether it's at AAA or with the Detroit Tigers. We're talking about a guy with not 70 raw power projections, 70 game power projections, and a 60 hit tool. That guy is your 2 or 3 hitter for the next 10 to 15 years. He's in your lineup every day somewhere.
The second he gets called up, and I think Riley Green might get the call before Torkelson, but yeah, I 100% agree. The second they get called up, both are playing every day.
All right, and then I'll be curious to see if he actually plays any time at third base as well. Obviously, you have Candelero over there as well, who made a little bit of a name for himself last year, and I think people are expecting more things out of him this coming year. But they did draft Torkelson technically as a third baseman. Hasn't played a whole lot of third base in his short time in the minors, but it'd be really interesting if he got that eligibility early on. All right, and then, Jeff, I'm going to close it out in Pittsburgh. Michael Chavis being traded over from Boston late in the season last year. You guys have him as the top first base option currently over where I think a lot of people are talking is Yoshi Tsutsugo being the everyday first baseman there. So I'm curious to know what your thoughts is whether or not Chavis actually has a role or a semi-everyday or actually everyday role, whether it's be at second base, first base, or any kind of mix. He played a little bit of right field last year as well. Is Chavis somebody that is going undervalued a little bit based on the fact that he's in Pittsburgh? He could find his way into a lot of different places. And is he going to play first base?
Yeah, he'll play mostly first. You might get some time elsewhere as well. Tsutsugo's not an everyday player. I think he had a nice little run. Last 45 plate appearances, he limped back to what he was doing prior to his hot streak, 190, 244, 238. I think it's a platoon. It might be Chavis can play elsewhere too. Some third base, although Hayes, only assuming Hayes is not healthy at that point in time. But I think it's going to be a split time thing, and they might get some DH at bats between the two of them too. I think there's not too many other obvious candidates on this roster. You're looking at maybe Cole Tucker if he doesn't play one of the starting outfield spots. And Anthony Alford and Ben Gamble don't strike me as building block guys, so there could be some playing time opportunities there. Point is, I think there's enough playing time to go around for both Chavis and Tsutsugo.
Kevin, have you targeted either one of these guys late on drafts, especially in the draft and holds that you've been in?
In draft and holds, I was drafting Tsutsugo quite a bit. I think I do have one or two teams that roster Michael Chavis, and I think Jeff hit on it at the end there. When you throw the DH into the National League as well, that helps both of those guys for sure.
All right. I think these are some interesting situations, especially a lot of these are late round flyers that you're taking in, whether it's in your draft and holds or at the very end of a 15-teamer. So situations that you should be keeping an eye on. Like I said earlier, hopefully all of this information that we're recording here today on Tuesday doesn't go completely out the window with different signings or trades or whatever in the next week before we actually send this out to the airwaves.
Or hopefully it does. And
yes,
it's still relevant.
Yeah. I'm with you on that.
Thank you for the correction.
Yeah.
But you should be keeping an eye on all the different depth charts. Rotowire has an amazing plethora of tools that you can utilize there, whether you're looking at that or the team pages over at Pitcher List, roster resources. There's a lot of different areas in which you can get your research. We talked about that last week with Scott Bogman. It's just what you use in the tools that you use at your disposal are immense, and pick and choose, make sure you're using the right ones that kind of fit what you're looking for in your league and what have you. Kevin, any words of wisdom to leave for the listeners as we head closer and closer to the deep draft season?
We touched on it earlier. It as far as what we're talking about this evening on this episode, it's pay attention and when spring training does start, and it will start at some point, pay attention. And then early in the season, pay attention to what teams are doing. And you can't always tell just by looking at a general traditional box score. Look at when guys were used, when, an example, the guy that's going to be the closer is usually pitching the third or fourth inning in a spring training game after the starter comes out, right? They're not the guy pitching the ninth inning in a spring training game, but that's an example. And keep an eye on the hitters, not just when they're used, how they're used. And it's because we've been talking about it in general as an industry for at least 2 or 3 seasons now. It became really hot topic with what Phil Deso did last year. And lots of people were talking about it during the season anyway. Derek Van Riper told us he tries to pay really close attention to at-bats and innings pitched. And he thinks he was really doing it, but he knows he wasn't doing it enough. I feel the same way. I think we got to pay attention to how guys are being used.
All right, I think that's really great advice, and keep an eye on your lineups as you're heading into draft season and building those rosters, because obviously the way you build your rosters at the start is going to be way different than what your roster looks like mid-season or Memorial Day, as Kevin alluded to earlier. But Jeff, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. As
Sure.
you mentioned off air, you sandwiched us in between a couple of different other recordings. So I'll let you get out of here. But before we do, can you remind everybody where, all the many places that they might be able to listen to you, any specific work that you might be working on over at Rotowire or anywhere else that everybody should be keeping a lookout for?
Sure. Thanks for scheduling me on the Jeff Erickson Overexposure Tour. I do appreciate it. You can catch me on SiriusXM, SiriusXM Fantasy on Monday through Thursday, 12 to 2 Eastern time. I usually do the Sunday show from 1 to 3 as well. We do 3 podcasts, but just check out the site too, rotowire.com/. get you a free 10-day trial. You don't need a credit card, just sign up, valid email address. You can check out all the tools that you guys talked about. I'd suggest really you use the My Leagues feature, and that can merge with the projected starters in season, the depth chart, our prospect rankings, all that. And it can tell you who's available, who's not, what things stand out. And that way you can manage your leagues just through that tool, and it really helps you out a lot there. So I'd recommend that. Rotowire.com/try is the best way to check that out. And you can catch me on Twitter at Jeff_Erickson.
Yeah, as Jeff mentioned, so many good tools over at Rotowire, and definitely utilize at least the 10-day trial to see what fits into your plans in your different leagues that you're playing in. Jeff, thanks so much for joining us here, though. It's going to wrap us up for episode 50 of On the Wire. Hopefully we've hit another 50, Kevin, by this time next year, and we can, hit that 100 mark. Make sure to help us out by subscribing, sharing, reviewing the podcast wherever you're listening. Even if your review is just a general tweet and not on a specific platform, still goes a long way to let us know what you think of the show, and let others know how much fun you're having listening. Make sure you're listening to all the great podcasts at Pitcher List Podcast Network by following at Pitcher List Pods on Twitter for updates, and subscribing to both the Pitcher List Fantasy Baseball podcast feed and the Pitcher List General Baseball podcast feed as well for all of our non-fantasy related pods. You can follow myself on the Twitter at 80grade. That's all spelled out. Kevin is at HastingKevin. Once again, thanks again to our guest, Jeff Erickson, is at Jeff_Erickson. And on behalf of Kevin Hasting, I am Adam Howe. With that, we bid you goodbye.